somebody's got to say something. Come on. I'm ready to do war.
I told you when I turned to this guy, we started discussing ideas endlessly in our office in the first couple of weeks of class, and I turned to him and said, talk baseball, a little this, a little that, a little sociology, economics. You're hardcore. So I like that. And he began going, and I turned to him and said, when Anthony came on, I had two new colleagues, Lisa and I. Finally, it was just her and I, and now we have this thing. Driving, right, these intersecting type of things, Anthony with history, Lisa and I with social, Matt with economics. And this is all dispersing down to you.
I'll go ahead. Matt, are there any, or do you know of any anti-sweatshop activists in the nations that have the highest percentage of sweatshop employees, and how successful are these activists in protesting against this industry? Do you know anything about
in those countries that have sweatshops, Cambodia? No, I don't know of any. I'm sure that there probably are. Under every rock, I'm sure there's somebody in some basement somewhere who's got some program or something. But no, I don't know of any of them. As a matter of fact, my understanding is that people in those countries look at protests here with a little bit of horror. They don't want to see, like the Child Labor Deterrence Act, right? That was obviously a bad thing. So even the threat, and that law was never even passed. Really, the threat, and so.
But let me ask you this then on a different note. Cold War ended in 1989. Do you know, can you talk a little bit about how the end of that 50-year proxy war affected this industry? Also, when we had the two super elephants going against developing nations or third world nations or whatever, they had to make a choice. Are you going to go with the Americans or go with the communists? Now the communist world is essentially gone, so we don't have that playoff, as it were. How has the end of that conflict affected this industry?
Again, that's a great question, and I don't have a very good answer for you. I do know that with the liberalization of markets in the old Soviet bloc, you're going to see more foreign direct investment. So I would be shocked if there weren't some sort of liberalization of capital inflows. That's exactly what happened in China, right? I mean, it's not 1989. China, Deng Xiaoping, to get rich is glorious, right? There was this movement. As late as 1961, right? You can find film footage from China from 1961. People looking like they're in Auschwitz, in a concentration camp. That was going on as late as the 60s.
That was about the time when Mao was attempting to experiment with replacing names with numbers. That workers in those communes would have numbers and not names.
Oh, it's a great policy. It works very well. Right? Hundreds of millions of people, literally. Throughout the 20th century, would die under these kinds of regimes. There were these top-down plans. Well, this is how we're going to do it. We're going to eradicate the bourgeois class. We're going to eradicate poverty. We're control it all from up here. And millions of people suffered and died as a result. China had a pretty major turn in the late 70s, where they opened up to foreign direct investment. They began respecting property rights. They began liberalizing their economy. And it's no coincidence that in that time, China, awash in natural resources, 1 billion people, the resources there. Tons of foreign capital came in, invested, and over 1 billion people escaped poverty in China in a very short amount of time. Between my birth, I had it up there, between my birth and my 29th birthday, 680 million people in China exited extreme poverty. That's incredible. We can't even comprehend that. But that's that process of economic development, and that didn't happen because of child labor laws or anything silly like that. That happened because of the basics of economic growth.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Sorry I didn't have a more
definite answer. I'll ask you another time.
Yeah. You can grill me hard some other time, but not in front of me.
Oh, I'm not grilling. We'll boil.
We send those questions to him ahead of time so he could prepare.
Yeah. No, we don't operate like that.
That's called Hollywood.
I have a question.
Yes, Jessica.
I know in our class we discussed some of the original intentions of what the minimum wage was in the United States.
Yes.
So, as far as our government involvement in this, I mean, is this a way for them just to prevent the United States outsourcing labor from underdeveloped countries? Like, do you think they have a good reason for wanting to do it, or is it really just to protect our economy?
Justin, so Jessica's a student of mine, 2 classes of mine, right? She knows how to put one in right in my wheelhouse to really get really controversial here. So let me try to answer that. And actually, I'm sorry, I'm going to answer this with analysis that I've given in class too. I think it's relevant to your question. So I prepared a whole bunch of other stuff for this talk that I just kind of capped out and I thought we'd go over in the Q&A. This is one of those things, the discussion of minimum wage, right? I figured when I brought that up that there would be a much larger discussion in the Q&A, so I'm prepared to have that one too. But here's how it goes. The minimum wage in this country versus restricting sweatshop production abroad, a lot of the same incentives are at play for people in our economy, certain actors, economic actors in our economy. So for example, if you've got a firm, let's call it firm A, business, whatever, you make whatever, it doesn't matter whatever, but you've got a production process in firm A producing good X. It doesn't matter what good X is, fill it in with whatever you'd like. You've got multiple ways to do it. 2 of the ways you can do it, 2 labor-intensive ways you can do it. Let's say you could hire 3 teenagers at $5 an hour. Low-skilled teenagers, right? They don't come out of the womb with a skill set. We have to learn. We learn by doing and all that. Relatively low marginal revenue product. Let's say you make 3 teenagers, $5 an hour, and over that hour they will produce 1X. And your total labor cost comes to $15 an hour, if you choose that route. There's another way you can go. Let's say, and I'm just throwing numbers out there, you can pay $20 an hour to 1 skilled laborer. Obviously, I mean, this is super simplified, I know, but gets the point across. Your total labor costs here are $15 an hour. You don't care how many people you hire. You just care about that bottom line. That's what we assume, that these guys are greedy. They're just looking at the bottom line. $15 an hour versus $20 an hour. Obviously, you're going to choose that lower cost alternative. That makes you more competitive. You can sell X now for $15.50. If you sold it for $15.50 at $20 of cost, well, you took a $4.50 loss. Go out of business. So you might look at this and say, well, this is great. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to elect for the low-skilled labor because my total labor costs of doing it this way are lower. Well, now that you give this person, here, let's get politics involved. Right? This entity right here, this worker who doesn't have a job, doesn't have the demand for their labor at $20 an hour, says, well, I don't want to compete by lowering my wage. I don't want to say, well, I'll work for $14.50. No, I want $20 an hour. How can I go about getting that? Well, how about we advocate for a minimum wage law? Think of the AFL-CIO. How many members of the AFL-CIO make the minimum wage? None of them. They all make, so why are they out there at picket lines with fast food workers saying $15 an hour? It's in their union, it's in the union's best interest to do so. If this worker can go lobby the federal government and say, we really care about the fortunes of these, you can't live off $5. And a lot of them give you this big bleeding heart story. And they go to Washington, D.C., and they advocate for a minimum wage of, say, I don't know, $7.25 an hour. And they get it passed, well, then all of a sudden it's illegal to do this. You want to do that, you're going to get fined. If you don't want to pay the fine, you're going to go to jail. That takes that option away. Now, instead of having to pay, have this option of paying $5 an hour, you've got to pay them, if you so hire them, $7.25. $7.25 times 3 is $21.75 per hour. Your total labor cost goes from $15 an hour to $21.75 if you employ the 3 teenagers. Now all of a sudden the calculus changes. You say, well, wait a second, gotta go with that. When you have, I'm sorry to suggest that unions in this country are disingenuous. I don't mean to suggest, I mean to flat out say it. There's a lot of disingenuous stuff where they'll advocate for these kinds of policies, and they can do it because good-intentioned people think, well, obviously you can't live off that, so yeah, let's get a higher wage. But notice what the economic effect is. The economic effect is to increase the demand for the labor of this worker at the expense of these unskilled workers. Typically, skilled laborers are highly politically organized, right? Unions are extremely organized. They have lobbies. What lobby is there in K Street for teenagers? Doesn't exist. With respect, then it's the same with the minimum wage. It's the same with, you know, oh, these garment producers in Bangladesh. Well, it's really cheap. Well, let's put up some sort of restriction on doing business with. That gives us greater demand for our labor here. It's a self-serving policy. Let me go a little bit further with that. I'm talking about the original. You mentioned in the first part of your question the original impetus behind minimum wage legislation in this country. The whole point, right? There's a wonderful paper by the economist Thomas C. Leonard called "Eugenics and Economics in the Progressive Era." He's a Princeton economist. This isn't some crackpot, right? And he wrote this paper about the history of minimum wage advocacy in this country. And he goes back and he reads early 20th century papers given by academic economists on the minimum wage, and their argument is, this is from the eugenicists, this Ivy League economist in the early 20th century making this argument. He goes through and he shows you all these instances of it. Their argument is this: look, black workers and other minorities are bidding down wages. That is, they have the situation where you have all these racist employers, and the only tool that low-skilled African Americans and other minorities have is to bid for lower wages to get their jobs. So that's what they do. And they push down wages, and that puts white people out of work. What we need to do is take that tool away from the blacks, away from the minorities, by passing a higher minimum wage. Make it illegal for them to bid for a lower wage to get a job. You have economists in journals in the early 20th century, not just one guy in one paragraph, but boom, boom, again and again and again and again, in order to cleanse the workforce of undesirables. The whole point for these economists of the minimum wage was to push out black people. That's it. The Davis-Bacon Act, which was passed in 1938, received a lot of its support. What did the Davis-Bacon Act do? It mandated that if you have a project and you receive more than $2,000 of funding from the federal government, you have to pay the prevailing wage. That is the union wage. This was a tool used to keep Southern black people out of the union, the really white union labor force. To make it so you couldn't say, well, let's use this cheap labor over here. So it disemployed all those workers and rewarded workers who were already relatively well off. You know, maybe that's not convincing to you. So let me hit one more example on this. Let me hit this. Here's another example I give to my students. I think there's a group of people here, and I remember getting an email from Joyce in the spring sometime. Is there a group of Ivy Tech employees who in the spring they go out and they clean up a park, like on one Saturday? Is that something familiar? Yeah. Yeah, right. So they volunteer their time on one Saturday, go help clean up a park, right? It's a noble thing, wonderful. Well, let's craft an example here, right? You got this group of people, they go out and clean up a park voluntarily. Let's say, despite their best efforts, the parks still aren't as clean as we would like them to be. In that scenario, do you think it would make sense to pass a law that says anybody who voluntarily shows up to help clean the park, you've got to stay here for 8 hours? Is that like the right way to like clean up the park better? Does anybody think that would be a good law? Seriously, anybody? No, nobody thinks that's a good idea. It's an absurd idea, right? Because people are busy, they have families, it's like, oh, I can only make it for 2 hours. But now if I only show up for 2 hours, I get fined by the city government of Fort Wayne. So forget it, I just won't show up. Right, wouldn't it make more sense to say, well, hey, if you want the park clean, get up on your butt and go clean it yourself. Or pay somebody to clean it. Put your own skin in the game. What does that have to do with the minimum wage? Well, some people voluntarily pay wages to low-skilled workers. But despite their voluntary efforts, low-skilled workers don't earn wages which we deem high enough. Does it make sense to mandate that the people who are already voluntarily employing them do more? What are you doing? You sit back in your armchair and just mandate these things. What are you doing? Put your skin in the game. Why don't you help out? There are many, many other policies that are better targeted toward low-income workers, and not just low-income workers, but impoverished workers than the minimum wage. The earned income tax credit, much better policy. furthermore, the last point on this, and we'll move on to T&A. The economist David Newmark, who's one of the foremost researchers in labor economics today, one of the, at the forefront of the minimum wage debate, which is probably the most contentious issue in labor economics, maybe even microeconomics, period, has estimated that if the minimum wage is increased from $10.10, or I'm sorry, from $7.25 to $10.10, which is a current proposal, and that if there were no disemployment effects from that, that is, you increase the price of the thing, but the demand curve over that region is perfectly inelastic. It's perfectly up and down. So there will be no reduction in quantity of labor hours demanded. Just assume that everybody who's making less than $10 an hour will keep their job and then at the same amount of hours and then make $10.10 over those hours. Full on 18% of those people, 18% of them, I'm sorry, 18% of the gain in wages as a result of this, 18% of the total monetary gain, assuming nobody loses a job, 18% of that gain in wages will go to workers from low-income households. 82% will go to, Noah down at Homestead, who has a weekend job at the grocery store, who already lives in a 3,500 square foot home. Or somebody else who's not living in an impoverished household. So basically what you're doing is like, okay, let's mandate that everybody show up at the park for 8 hours a day to clean up the park. And then the people that do show up, you take 4 out of 5 of them, put them on a bus, take them down to Sycamore Hills and say, okay, everybody, let's clean up the golf course now. Anthony.
I was just thinking about going.
That was the last question.
Pardon me?
At least have.
Lisa's going to burn
No,
it.
listen, go ahead.
Well, so yeah, we talked about history, we've talked about econ, so here's the sociological point of view question, all right? Because if we're
We'll end on this, we get the last word.
If we're, no, we're not, Maggie's the last word, the economist. But
Unless you
if
stump me
economic growth, right, is, out of poverty is accelerating, and you pointed out very accurately the problems we've had historically with pushing people out based upon race, based upon gender. We know even in 2015, there's still a race and a gender gap in terms of pay for different people. We can find the numbers to support that. Then how does this account for those changes? How do we, whether it's sweatshop or minimum wage, how do we, I guess the sociological point of view then comes back to the ethical question. What is the economic moral imperative, I guess, if we pair it with history and if we pair it with sociology? How do we make things better for those people who continue to suffer?
Let me see if I can pull this up. I don't know if it's going to let me. I had it, now it's not going to let me.
Does the question make sense?
I think I understand. What I wanted to pull up in response to that, I had a graph on here that's, I thought I saved to the PowerPoint, but it's not fun. Geez, that PowerPoint might have been an old one. I hope everything correlated with what I was saying. Okay. Well, okay, so yeah, a wage gap between minorities and whites, plainly evident. Now, oh my gosh, the causal factors there are just tons and tons. There are many, many, many. I think part of it is the fact that we have had institutions in this country which have, laws